It's
Okay. Hi. Good morning, good evening, and all the Digital Futures participants. So this is a special program for the Doctoral Consortium of Tongji University of Digital Future 2022. Today is a great honor to have a special guest here, Dean Li, who will give an opening speech to today's lecture. And firstly, we would like to invite Xiangning Li to give the welcome speech to today's lecture. So Xiangning, please.
Thank you, Professor Philip Yuan, for the invitation and introduction. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you, instructors, students, researchers, to the annual Digital Futures events on behalf of the College of Architecture and Urban Planning of Tongji University. This year is very year for the whole college. It's the 70th anniversary of the founding of our Sino-Tibetan. So very special, and I'm very happy and honored to be here to. For the past decade, the College of Architecture and Urban Planning has hosted and supported the Digital Futures summer workshops, witnessing its growth from a global phenomenon. Each year, the workshops and conferences bring new topics and new ideas and discuss spreading the sharing architecture. So it has also become an integral part of schools' international collaboration, by many and professors. I would like to thank the numerous who studied, taught, participated, and contributed, enabling and empowering such a program. I thank you again for being here today with us for Digital Futures 2022, the Doctoral Consortium platform. I would like to thank also Professor Li Shiqiao, who is giving a series of 3 lectures during the following 3 days. For his contribution to the program, Professor Shiqiao is Wyndham Professor in Asian Architecture, School of Architecture, University of Virginia, where she teaches history theory and directs PhD program in the constructed environment program. He studied architecture at Tsinghua University, and he was from China, who obtained a PhD from AA, School of Architecture, and Birkbeck College, University of London. Prior to joining University of Virginia, Professor Li Shiqiao practiced architecture in London and Hong Kong and taught at the AA School of Architecture, National University of Singapore, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research enlarges thinking spaces within which more sensible and effective actions in the constructed environment can be formulated. He seeks pathways of intellectual understanding and experience in architecture that aim to restore our progressively technology and the ecological strained world to its fertile functions. Some of his design research and teaching is featured in typological drift, emerging cities in China, and Cologne Culture District, both co-authored and co-edited with Lawrence. So I do hope that you would learn from and of course enjoy such an experience this summer. Thank you again, Professor Li Shiqiao, and all this international PhD program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xiangning Li, gave this opening speech to the summer PhD program, and also will follow by a special event, yearly event, which greatly supported by our school over the past few years. I think it will be a great contribution from Tongji to the academic world. I think I would like to share my screen to briefly introduce the event. Recent event here. Okay. So this is the PhD program, which actually we planned for the summer in the next 2 to 3 weeks, which 3 courses of the PhD program. Actually, we name as an international sharing doctoral consortium because we want to share all these courses to both YouTube and Bilibili. Right now, we open another platform on the Crystal Voxel Metaverse platform, which showing our attitude to address all the future researchers. You can assemble different knowledge system or sequence, which divided by sequence of lectures. So right now on the platform YouTube, we have around 100 different lectures. So year by year, we're adding more lectures on this platform. So the future knowledge learning system we're looking forward to set up is something like a new assemblage system. The students or professors can reorganize all the resources by themselves. It's like a future opening teaching platform, global platform on the internet. So the courses is subdivided by some topic and the philosophy and theory of architecture. Like Shi Qiao gives 3 lectures is in the first part, the left one. And the middle one is about a performance-based or the new design theory part. And the right one is especially parametricism and digital theory from Patrick Schumacher. He will give 6 lectures 2 weeks later. So it's like a very interesting sharing platform. Year by year, we change the topic, and looking forward, you can engage and participate to these courses. And at the same time, we also want to announce in this month, June the 26th, we will launch the inaugural issue for architecture intelligence, which is we plan and doing like 4 years work, collaborating with Springer publisher. And this is a scientific evidence-based research platform, and also a peer-reviewed journals for original research papers focusing on the 3 future scenarios, including the smart habit, virtual habit, and the space habit. And looking forward, all the PhD, especially the PhD students, you can contribute your research and publish your papers on this platform. So the inaugural issue right now, we have like 15 essays from all over, including Mario Capel, Newlich, Mike Xie, Patrick Schumacher, and Matthew Thompson. We have a lot of very important academic researchers contribute to the inaugural issue. And Xiaoning Li already gave the opening speech. I think great thanks to our dean to give sincere support to this program.
My pleasure.
Okay, and Shi Qiao, I think I met Shi Qiao in 2019. That year, I was invited as the professor, visiting professor in UVA. And on the plane flight to the UVA, I read one of Shi Qiao's book, I think, which is extremely interesting about the modernization of China and Chinese cities. So the most impressive for my understanding of Shi Qiao's research is the linguistic background and the language, extremely elegant and deep, profounded, reviewed activities of thoughts in Asia and in China. So he is one of the most representative or prominent professor who make a very deep, intense and interesting research and understanding of both Asia and South Asia. His background, as I know, who is graduate from Tsinghua, bachelor degree, and I think he is the first to scholar to got the PhD from AA architecture school, and showing his great, it's not easy at the end of the 80s and beginning of 90s to got the PhD in AA. And afterwards, he not only makes certain historical research in the university, like Hong Kong U and the Hong Kong Technical University or Cultural University, and also in Singapore, but also he working in the office in Hong Kong for a certain time. That's showing his special skills, not only making historical or theoretical research, but also working as a practitioner, understanding the real practice of architecture. And in UVA, I think Shi Qiao play a leading roles, especially in the historical theory research of architecture. And also he play a leading roles serving as a director of the PhD program. I think the PhD program in UVA is really good. And it's not a big number, but I know some of the PhD candidates here. I think all of them have very special and focused research major, and we should learning and exchange different knowledge in the future. We're looking forward to set up the collaboration with UVA, with Shi Qiao. So these 3 lectures, I think, which based on the special topic, the language and architecture. And the first lecture today, Shi Qiao will introduce the topics Indo-European and the Sinitic divergence. So the brief introduction I want to read and make an opening for this special lecture is, if his understanding, if architecture and city are the language learning constructs, then the structure of the type of language and its derivative are consequential in both the production and reception of them. The lecture outlines the interdisciplinary research in historical linguistics, archaeology, and genetics to explain the great expansion of Proto-Indo-Indian language, PIE, from Eastern Europe steppe to Northern India and Mediterranean. It explains the deep structural difference between the Indo-European and the Sinitic in strategy of meaning. And through them, the general linguistic theories from linguistic relativism of the Sapir and Wolff to linguistic universalism of Chomsky, De Francis, and Hannes. So we're looking forward to have the great special lecture from Shiqiao Li. So let's welcome the Whedon professor from UVA, Shiqiao, to give us the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thank you, Xiangling. I think this is really, I'm delighted to be part of this, and indeed I'm honored to be part of this. As you talk about the details of my past, I was actually reminded a lot of things that I tend not to remember all the time. Yes, we have, one of the things that I did realize in a major way when I was a student at the AA, which was also the topic of my first academic paper that I wrote at the AA, is how the change of language, for me, the transitioning from Chinese to English made a huge change, not just as a tool, but as a way to look at the world. And I was absolutely fascinated by structuralism at that time, and it's never left me. And so here it is, I'm talking about it again. Actually, the last time I talked about it, it was at the AA when I gave a public lecture on language and architecture, and Patrick Schumacher was there. We had a great discussion. We don't really agree on everything that I said, but I think that the debate and exchange was really exciting. Okay, so let me just get into what I want to introduce today. If I can just share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so today's lecture is the first one of 3 lectures that I describe as quite straightforwardly thought, language, and architecture. I want to, this is how it's laid out. It's in the program, and maybe I don't need to talk about them, except to say that today is more introductory, and tomorrow and day after tomorrow will be a little bit more in depth in each direction, because I do see this kind of divergence of civilizational developments are quite fundamental to the way we can imagine architecture. So today's kind of introductory notes are really about the Indo-European and the Sinitic divergence. I mean, language families, Indo-European language family, and what's known as Sino-Tibetan language family. I want to begin with what is usually known as the Indo-European language family. It's a big one. Just little over half of the world's population speak some version of the Indo-European languages, and there's 2.9, almost 3 billion people. It's 45.72% according to ethnologue.com. I have here on the screen an interesting graphic that's made by Guardian that portrays the language family, Indo-European language family, as a huge tree that kind of start with a root, and then it started to have branches, and then you have all kinds of developments from the same root of that language family into different versions of the Indo-European language. I guess that's really, the metaphor is quite apt. It is a family, and it is a kind of tree here. I'm showing you the work. This is a little dry and unacademic, and it's the same graph that's drawn by David Anthony in this wonderful book he wrote called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, that shows the origin. And this diagram is a little bit more specific, and it really begins to describe the root as the root of Proto-Indo-European language. We don't have any surviving kind of, speakers of that language. Everything we know about it is purely by conjecture, and hopefully a good, reasonable, educated guess of what the Proto-Indo-European language sounded like. Of course, it goes through a whole range of permutations from Germanic to Celtic and to Italic and to Hellenic and Anatolian, Iranian, Indic, and to Tocharian. It's interesting, Tocharian is actually within China. It's in Xinjiang province that was spoken in the form of Indo-European language. The way it is a fascinating topic, and it really is a, the study to trace how the Proto-Indo-European language, which is a language that was supposedly spoken about 4,500 years before the Common Era, that's almost like 6,500 years ago, is a no easy task. And this is really a monumental study, and people have been looking at it. A huge amount of scholars have spent a lot of time looking over a long period of time to kind of understand what it is and to reconstruct it. And it's a form of linguistic archaeology, if you like, of the language and the homeland. The current consensus of it is that the homeland is somewhere near the current area of Ukraine and southern Russia. David Anthony's book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, used archaeology, historical linguistics, and genetics, and really in combination, a very, very complex enterprise to create language that's dead for a long time. There are certain kind of, language, if you like, is like genetics, and the sounds and the word forms and so on carry with them not only the current meaning of these words, but also its ancestral roots. Just like, David Anthony was explaining that your body carries different bits and pieces of your ancestors, and that's how language functions as a kind of a piece of historical artifact. The way, for example, linguists began to look at it is to understand how sounds change, and that they likely, one of the many principles of the changes of sound is that the hard sounds tend to change to soft sounds, like the sound K kind of slowly would morph into some kind of S or H. So the Latin word civitas, which means community and city, which is actually a word that we use a lot in architectural theory, changed to the French word cité, which is, a change from K to S, civitas to cité. And this is known as palatalization. So the Proto-Indo-European language word for 100 may have started with the K sound and remained in Latin. The Latin for 100 is centum. And when it kind of shifted to Sanskrit, it became santum. In French, it became cent. In Gothic, it became Honda. In Old English would be Hund. In German would be hundred. And in English, 100. So something like this. It's fascinating. I'm not a linguist, but I'm really happy to read all this. The thing about the homeland is that that area of the world is known as the kind of European, Eurasian steppe. It's just really vast stretches of open grassland. I know travel has always been difficult for all people, particularly in ancient world, and we're talking about 4,500 BC. So here it's very difficult to walk. And what happened was that somehow domestication of horses took place, and this we have plenty of evidence for that. And in Altai, for example, in Kazakhstan, there were hundreds of thousands of animal bones, and mostly horse bones, that can be found, that can be dated to that, to the era of Proto-Indo-European language. There has been a lot of debate whether the exact place and time of the earliest domesticated horses, where did it happen, who rode them and so on. But the general agreement is that horses were domesticated, and it was such a hugely significant event to basically turn grassland into a viable life. So you have cattle and you have horse. And so the horse and the cattle became a form of life that turned grass into something that's nutritious for people. So what's more significant is that kind of during the period of 2,800 BCE to about 1,800 BCE, we see archaeological evidence of horses becoming a war weapon. And that's really quite an extraordinary transformation. And here we see evidence in a place called Sintashta in southern Russia, where Soviet Union Soviet archaeologists unearthed burial sites that really included not only weapons, but also horse bones, but also chariots. So this is really a great kind of insightful kind of archaeological discovery. And there were in Sintashta, there were 40 graves, and it's a town of a circular shape of 140 meters in diameter. And here is, I'm showing you where that location is, and this is where Ukraine and southern Russia is located. And this is a drawing of what was found in the graves: the chariots, horses, and weapons. So I want to say that in agreement with a lot of historical research, that it all came together at this point when the chariot sitting on the horses, domesticated, supporting movements of people and weapons to conquer, to occupy large stretches of territories. And this is really an incredible development that had not really happened in any parts of the world. And here we are basically through that archaeological site and many others, witnessing what David Anthony says, the greatest linguistic philosophical takeover of the world. And it is enormously significant. This is really, you can see this map, and it's a little skewed, but you can see the Himalaya mountain range in India on the right here, and Europe on the other. And from this Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European homeland, you can see from 4000 BC to 1000 BC, enormous expansion of Indo-European language and culture and way of life, all the way to Scandinavia and to Spain, to the Mediterranean, to Greece, but also to Persia, but also to northern India, and a little bit into the Xinjiang province. I'm in this on this map, and I marked 2 points, 2 red dots. One indicate where Tocharian B was spoken as a language, and the other indicating Old Irish. It's very interesting if you look at some linguists' documentation of how Tocharian B and Old Irish sound so similar. Father is Pasa, Ata, and mother is Masa, Mata. There's really, this cannot be a coincidence. It's basically coming from the same language root. And this is really another evidence for us to use to trace the ancient roots of the Proto-Indo-European language. And one of the most interesting kind of landmark event was this young English man who was sent to India to take over some of the administration, and he was a judge in Calcutta. Part of this is really we're zooming all the way to back to forward to 18th century. William Jones, who was sent to India as a judge in Calcutta, a land where the British were supposed to kind of rule a whole bunch of uncivilized people, and then he discovered. He was a judge, Sanskrit was the legal language of the local population, and he learned Sanskrit. And he said, the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a strong affinity, both in roots and of verbs and in the forms of grammar that could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong, indeed, that no philosopher, no philologer could examine all three without believing them to have sprung from the common source, which perhaps no longer exists. So we were talking about the Proto-Indo-European language. Also a surprise that the language of the people they're supposed to subjugate turned out to be a language that's more sophisticated in structure and in syntax and grammar than English. So that kind of great linguistic philosophical takeover ends up today looking like this. This is really a map of nation states around the world. And if you look at it through European colonization in the 18th century and 19th century, Indo-European languages kind of spread across the world from not only the Eurasian continent, but also to Africa, to Australia, to North, Central and South America. It's pretty much taken over the entire world, except one area that's in gray right now. If you look at it here, you know what I'm talking about, which is a place where the Sino-Tibetan language family is open. This is not insignificant. It's 21% of the world's population, 1/5, and some would argue more. And in fact, the Chinese is a single language. If you don't calculate the language family, is the largest by far, the language with the largest native speakers, native users, Spanish to second. So it's pretty significant, and it is structured so differently from Indo-European languages, and it's based on shapes. We use languages every day, both English and Chinese, but we don't really think about it. I think it's really why linguistics is so important for us to think about language, because the more familiar we are with languages, the less likely we're able to think about it because it's so natural to us. So when we talk about the Chinese language, to me, it's obvious that it's a fact that Chinese is the only major living language and a writing system that's based on shapes. Kanji dictionary in the 18th century had about 49,000 characters. That's a lot. We generally in daily use 6,000 of them. A literate person in China would have the ability to read and write 6,000. Some linguists believe that we have in Chinese 214 semantic components and 800 semi-phonetic indicators. It just tells you how the word is pronounced, but it's not consistent. Often we pronounce words wrongly, and because it's really not related to how you say it, unlike the alphabetic languages or Indo-European languages. It is a single script, not a subset of something else. And it is highly adapted to writing, a bit like the really, really ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform. For those of you on this, familiar with that, is really an interesting language to look into. Instead of the horse and the cattle, you really have a very different way of life in China, and particularly since the Ming Dynasty, the imperial ideology, if you like, deeply cultivated the sensibility of staying on your land, cultivate your land, and it's kind of agriculture. You know, sometimes historians would call this a sedentary way of life rather than the nomadic way of life. You know, unlike dynasties that were established in China by Xianbeis or Mongols or Manchus, and they were kind of horse riding people, a bit like the Indo-Europeans rather than the Chinese people who would rather do something else. Here's a really interesting book, a small book, but I thought it was quite interesting. This, you know, not very famous, and this, it's called The Step and the Song by Howard Peake and Herbert Fleury, who kind of sketched out a distinction between the Indo-European and the Chinese ways of life as the sedentary and the nomadic or pastoral, in the sense that the pastoral or nomadic way of life is basically plunder and return. You go and then sack a city and take everything, and then you come back and you then repeat again. You know, it's kind of very mobile. And the sedentary life is like the Chinese, who would then work on land and produce a lot of desirable goods, and that kind of build up a relationship between the two that's played out over many, many centuries in Chinese history, where the northern tribes will come down and the Chinese will defend it, and sometimes it's war, sometimes it's marriage. So it's really interesting. So what's even more interesting, if you think with the pastoral sensibilities, is that they put a lot of value on frontiers, the idea of frontiers, horizons, and new territories. You know, this is the kind of language and that we use, you know, like, you know, in where I teach, to indicate excitement, creativity, you know, to indicate the goals of knowledge. You know, you've got to kind of, you know, push new frontiers and so on. We look at the, you know, the Chinese intellectual sensibility, the frontiers like you know, 边缘, it's really not as important as the idea of 中, you know, like center, like 中国. It's something else. So it's really interesting to think about this. And this is really the reason why I want to talk about thought language, and language as, you know, thought connection. And I have to acknowledge the depth of this term coming from the French philosopher François Julien, which I thought is really interesting and accurate to really describe what we are confronting when we think about language. Let me give you some examples, which I thought might be interesting to reflect a little bit. In Indo-European languages, for example, an action is always described as a action either of the past, present, or future, either real or hypothetical. It sometimes is gendered, and certainly it's numbered. So it has a lot of specificity when you describe an action. And it, you know, it's not just something that happens abstractly, but it is really something that has to be linked to a range of descriptors. And then that becomes the almost like the subtext of an action that you want to describe. But none of this is the case in Chinese. You can certainly use an action without specifying any of this, and it wouldn't be possible in English or, you know, a number of Indo-European languages. So to these language categories, cultivate categories of the concept of the past. For example, the idea of history. And think about that. It really takes a little bit of time for us to kind of make that jump. Or, you know, having to specify a subject and an object of an action. the beginning of a concept of cause and effect. So that's basically philosophy. If you read Immanuel Kant, and cause and effect is a major thing. Another example that's quoted by David Anthony was that in Hopi, Hopi is one of the Native American languages, very, very accomplished, very interesting language. And when describing an event, you must use marker to specify if you witnessed the event yourself, heard about it from others, or consider it to be an unchanging truth. So not a lot of languages demand that kind of specificity. So what does that mean? That the language then forces you to think about what it is. It's just, a bit like, I don't know, the third example would be in Chinese, the paternal and maternal family relatives are named differently, which is not the case in English. You use aunt to say all the aunts, and not your father's sisters or your mother's sisters, and they're not differentiated. What does this mean in terms of family hierarchy? I think one of the most incredible differences between the Chinese and the Indo-European languages is grammar, having grammar or not. Indo-European languages use grammatical markers, and Chinese almost has no grammatical markers. And what does this mean? And does this have an impact on how inflected, this is sometimes called the inflection, inflected languages, that languages change constantly to capture the subtleties of meanings. So how does that make us think differently? How does that make us make different tools, whether they are specific or general? Those are the things that we can certainly think about. Once when I was talking about this in a class, and then the student asked me a really interesting question, is the binary script, the computer language that we use to produce digital fabrication, is that Indo-European or Sinitic? I don't know. I think it's, I thought that, at the time it was Indo-European, but we can all think about it. American linguist and psychologist Alfred Bloom, in the 1980s, he wrote a really controversial book, which was refuted by a lot of scholars, particularly scholars who know Chinese really well, is that he says that the Chinese do not think counterfactuals, meaning that if this, then that. It is really, it's a language that embodies hypothetical conditions so that you can think without being tethered to reality. So they're called counterfactuals. And counterfactuals, of course, is fundamental to scientific thinking and theory. He then made conclusions that there are certain cultural features, that certain weaknesses in Chinese culture that comes out of that kind of absence of counterfactual, the usage of counterfactuals. I think it's an interesting observation, but it's to me quite obvious that it is actually very easy to think counterfactuals, and it's not difficult at all. And then my instinct is to say that this is really not a matter of ability; it is a matter of choice. It is really, it's a decision that a particular kind of thought language makes, if you like, in relation to how to proceed with theorizing. One additional experiment that I thought was really interesting was the duration of sounds and the ability to do certain things. So this is really in mathematics, and Welsh as a language, numbers take longer to say than English numbers. And this explains, in one experiment that digit spans is like the ability for people to remember random numbers without connection between them. The digit spans are much longer in English-speaking children than in Welsh-speaking children. So somebody did a similar experiment with Cantonese-speaking children in Hong Kong, and we found out that it's actually 9.9, the digit span. That's 2 digits higher than comparable studies in the West. It's interesting how the sound of numbers affect a certain kind of mathematical abilities. But there are lots of course, controversy over the studies. But I think it's really, this is not essentializing abilities. It's really just tracing the ability of language, the ability of the mind, and the way in which it relies on language to do certain things. It is true that when you say 10,000 in English, there are many, many sounds. And in Chinese, you just say one thing. So like you have this kind of monosyllabic kind of numbers that tend to be faster for Chinese students to put numbers together and do calculations. So with all that, and I guess what I'm really getting at is this very simple diagram. I want to say that language does not equal architecture. Language goes to thought, and thought influence architecture. That's really how, to put it in a very simple way, that's how it's sort of works. And I think that also explains the kind of linguistic theories, and particularly in semiology, and postmodernism in the 1980s and 1990s, when almost the entire field of architecture was interested in language and semiotics. And then that explains why that approach is deeply problematic, and because there was too much an equation between language and architecture. In addition to that, we have something called structuralism, which is something that we all are familiar with. And the basic assumption here is that language has a structure. That structure has an implication on the structure of pretty much everything in the society to which values are attached. Institutions of power, meanings of fashion and art, systems of architecture, and so on and so forth. And also a lot of critical theory relies on structuralism to make critiques of capitalism, because capitalism is a system that makes use of that kind of language-like structure really well. And it's basically producing differentiations of values and gaps, and then pushing consumers basically to spend in order to close these gaps. It's very easy to imagine that if some cool guy who has bought something, and then advertising would capture that, and then everybody would rush to buy the same thing so that you can look also cool. So that's a kind of it's a kind of, this is it's kind of monetized version of structuralism, which is deeply problematic in many ways to the quality of life that we live today. So in that understanding, the diagram is a little bit simpler. Basically, the structure of language has a particular kind of reflection on the structure of architecture and society. The last point I want to make in terms of the thought language section is that anyone who's thinking about these things will probably have to encounter this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and basically two scholars of linguistics who argue that the language determines thought. And that sets off a lot of discussion, and some people would say, no, it doesn't. And other people say, of course it does. So we are kind of faced with a uncertain conclusions here. My take on this is that the problem comes from the fact that we tend to treat language differences in the same way. The difference between Italian and Spanish is very small, but the difference between Latin and Chinese is huge. So how do you actually talk about them in the same way? So this is really why we should be a little bit more differentiated and perhaps not, talk about this whole topic in such a generic way. And this is why today I'm really talking about a thought language divergence between the Indo-European and the Sinitic. I think perhaps the significance is more easily understood in this context. So the divergence. It's hard to describe, but then I want to say that thought language in the Indo-European context places huge importance on how language sounds. So it's actually language is the language of sound. It is the writing is actually notations of sound. It doesn't matter which Indo-European language you look at, and basically they are kind of a string of syllables, and they're called signifiers, that really does not have any intrinsic connection to the thing that the word is describing. For example, water here, I use the word water. You might as well use Wasser in German or aqua in Italian, but there's no connection there. It is really made of, in the classical kind of linguistic theory of structuralism, three parts. First is the signifier, which is the string of syllables. The second is the idea of water, which is really what's known as the signified. That's how it's the idea that you form in your head. And the third one is, of course, referent, which is water as water. So if you look at this diagram, this is made up with some random images I found in my files. That water kind of, when it is written or spoken in the Indo-European language, has a three-step process. And this is what Ferdinand Saussure was describing. And that it really is from the substance to the idea and then to the signifier. So that's quite important process. And that process, I would say, I added a note there that the most important thing that happened in that process is abstraction. In the third lecture, I'll come back to this thing and some philosophical developments that took place historically in reaction to that abstraction, that the shape of water loses in the process. So in emphasizing sounds, the Indo-European civilization, because of the language character, has really an extraordinary paradox, which is really about somehow one needs to use writing, but then somehow writing is understood to be something alienating. It takes idea away from the mind. So, for example, like Socrates, we know Socrates, he did not write, but then most of his ideas survived from Plato's writing. So without Plato, we wouldn't even know, who Socrates was. And he was then so important to Western philosophy. So the compromise here is really the writing script staying abstract, and then uses grammatical markers. In the version of the Indo-European language, Sanskrit, things are different. Actually, people were able to keep it oral for a much longer time. And this is Rig Veda. Don't have time to go into detail, except to say that this hugely important text has been kept oral for a long period of time. Ferdinand de Saussure, when he wrote his influential writings in general linguistics, he really wrote about language as speech. And he said the language is a well-defined object in the heterogeneous mass of speech acts. In setting up the science of language within the overall study of speech, I have also outlined the whole of linguistics. There's no mistake, and even in that diagram, that communication is all about speech. So the Sinitic language, as we know that it is very different, it really maintains a shape. And here is the same idea of water, but it has, and this is how water that's written in the oracle bones is the most ancient form, and it still retains its shape. And it's basically a reasonable, a very well thought out shape, because water has a kind of continuous body of flow, but also has soft edges. Those are different 4 splashes around it that really makes it both strong and soft at the same time. So I would say that here water has the language, the character of water it comes from a 2-step process. That process does not go through an abstraction, but more like a process, what I would call figuration. The pattern remains. Pattern recognition, therefore, to me, is a very strong kind of Chinese intellectual tradition. In this case, manifested through the practice of feng shui, where like in the European Western context, and pattern reading is much less pronounced. It's more like when you look at architecture, it's more like you look at the object itself and not reading of a pattern of a larger systems. The importance of writing is very, very different when it's, you trace some of the historical writings of how important writing it is to the Chinese culture. And here is the Emperor Cao Pi, who wrote, at the end of this great era of Han, which was a establishment of Chinese culture and language. The Chinese people are sometimes known as the Han people that came from that era, that writing continues even if the body dies. So really that's the key argument, and very different. And people take pleasure in writing. Writing has a certain prestige. Thinking about how writing appears on buildings, in the Roman building and in the Chinese building. And in the Chinese building, the writing needs its own materiality. It kind of stands above architecture. It's almost like it imposes itself as a more important layer than a Roman building, where writing is more like carved into architecture rather than subservient to architecture. same relationship to land. The investment in writing is enormous in the Chinese context. This is probably, if anyone who wants to be a calligrapher, you probably have to begin with this piece, and which is it's called Lanting Shi, preface to the poems collected from the Orchid Pavilion, 353 AD. Incredible, beautiful calligraphy that has been held as the golden standard for calligraphy. And I can't resist to show you the Chinese artist Qiu Zhijie in 1990s who did a performance piece to copy this Lanting Shi 1,000 times. He literally copied them 1,000 times. After 50 times, it became totally black, just like that. And so he said that he was like doing Zen calligraphy from 50 to 1,000. In a way, as I thought it was really interesting, both in terms of the importance of this piece, but also as a critique of how writing affects mind and thinking. And talking about that, I think a way to understand, a common criticism of Chinese language is that it has a lot of homophones, like one sound and means 10, 20, 50 different words. And that's totally unacceptable for a linguist in the Indo-European tradition. And this is exactly two of them, John de Francis and William Hannes wrote. And in their books on Chinese language, not only that, particularly William Hannes said that because of that, the East Asians have less creativity because they invested too much memory in remembering how to write these languages, which are totally unreasonable. And they're basically, languages with half-shaped phonetic features, and which will inevitably transform itself into a phonetic language. So this is, to me, completely kind of misunderstanding Chinese language, is really unthinking criticism from the background of Indo-European linguists. There's another note that I thought was interesting to think about. I was sitting on a stage at this year's graduation when I actually went on the stage to speak the names of everyone who, some of them, who graduated. So in a way, I think if you think about the Chinese way of kind of showing how successful you are is through writing. Your name will be kind of, displayed on a bond, on the, releasing on the roll as a piece of writing, rather than name spoken by a person. So, and that brings to the idea of public speaking and public space, and the space and the speaking space and speech, they are deeply connected with one another. So taking one more step to think about Indo-European architecture theory, not, as I said in the beginning, not the semiology of the 1980s, but more like thinking about how thought develops in a direction that begins to formulate differentiations of occasions of use. And this is functionalism. This is basically typology. One can argue that in ancient Chinese architecture, there was only one type, which is the roof, the column, and the base, and that's it. And the European architecture for a long time has had a lot of types, classical orders, functional forms, and contemporary version of typology would be functionalism, which basically pushes the building to look different with each function. So that is inflection, So this is really the architecture, the inflection. If you can certainly rewrite the entire history of Western architecture with that idea in mind, that it is really a language of inflection, that thought language produced the architecture theory, and sometimes literally becoming language. This is Christopher Alexander pattern language, which has been influential. And the second kind of way to think about it is really that process of abstraction. I'm going to go talk about this much more in depth next lecture. I just want to mention it here that the Chinese text, for example, Yuan Ye would suggest kind of do something appropriate to the place, not something that's completely idealized. This is not the case, even you think about Plato's The Republic, or think about St. Augustine's The City of God, or Thomas More's Utopia, or Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. These are the kind of iconic Western kind of philosophical texts that tells you to basically forget about everything that you have and then begin to imagine kind of utopian versions or visions of what could be the best. It is incredibly productive, useful tool, but it can sometimes also become a little bit obsessed. People can get obsessed with this and begin to kind of take us to very different places than where we want to go. Like these examples, Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer, or Norman Foster creating, I don't know, kind of utopian visions which never quite worked. But it's been a critical component of Western architecture. And if you look at the history, this is just a small collection of a large number of this type of projects that are quite fundamental to Western architecture. Moving forward, I want to kind of think with David Anthony to say that Indo-European expansion as the greatest linguistic and philosophical takeover of the world also became a kind of an event that made the world a little bit narrower, expansion as a narrowing of perception. And David Anthony says that many other language families have become extinct as Indo-European languages spread. It is possible that the resultant loss of linguistic diversity has narrowed and channeled the habits of perception in the modern world. So in other words, we have all become Indo-Europeans or not. We used to have, Chinese was not the only language that used shape as the key component. We have Anatolian hieroglyphics, a very ancient script, about 500 object images. It was often used concurrently with cuneiform. And here's an example of a king's seal. That's a combination of hieroglyphics and cuneiform. Cuneiform is this kind of triangular wedge-shaped thing that was very easily, with a very simple tool, pressed into wet mud, kind of clay, so that through this kind of number and direction of those triangular shapes, wedges, you form a kind of alphabet-like language, and very influential, very interesting development in the history of languages. And here's one that really shows a combination of both, like the outer ring here, that's the seal, that's the impression of, these are different seals, but similar. The outer rings here is cuneiform, and here's the hieroglyphic, and this really, it shows obviously that the images are more important than the cuneiform. Cuneiform are more convenient, but images are more important. The same thing that happened in the Egyptian hieroglyphics that became extinct and had to be deciphered in the 18th century. That actually the most valued script is actually this one, the cartouche, which basically is made of shapes. And of course, to adapt to easy writing, and then you have other two forms, and hieratic and demotic Egyptian writing. But clearly, the form itself just has some kind of magical powers. It declined, and I don't want to go into details here, and basically was replaced by a kind of alphabetic language derived from the Greek alphabet. And the saddest story in all this is probably the Mayan hieroglyphics, basically extinct, and we still have a very faint knowledge. We don't have a lot of good knowledge of how it works, and it was deciphered only in the 20th century by David Stewart. It was a combination of phonetic symbols and object images. And the way it disappeared was a tragic story, but this is also something that's characteristic of European colonization since the 16th century. Diego de Landa, who was arrived in Yucatan, which is part of Mexico today, and facing the Mayan culture and Mayan writing. He was fascinated, but also he wrote a book on it. He was also frightened by it and thinking that this is kind of, devil's notes or something. So he started a kind of personal one-man Spanish Inquisition in Yucatan, basically burned all texts, and probably there are only two books left in the world today, and most of the whole writing and culture language disappeared. So that really is that kind of narrowing of perception and the kind of the erasure of diversity that happened with events like this, and tragic, but it's true. So how come Chinese survived? That's a really interesting question. I think China, if you look at this map, it's quite useful because it has exaggerated topography. That the red dots, of course, shows the direction of Indo-European expansion, but China sits behind a whole range of barriers. Dense jungle in the south, and the Tibetan Plateau in the south, southwest, and Taklamakan Desert and Gobi Desert in the north, and also there's the Great Wall. So actually, it's kind of insulated itself, maybe really protecting its sedentary way of life. And has done so quite successfully. But I think also compared with other hieroglyphic languages, that the technologies of brush, ink, and paper, which were developed highly in China, and really made the task of writing manageable. It's really hard to write Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's just completely, not adapted to writing. So there's there's a technological development in China that really made it doable, and it really remained. I think the only kind of major living language today that really captures shapes of the world. In the third lecture, I'm going to really expand on that. The importance of capturing shapes in your language and the problems of it. So having said all this, I want to kind of end today's introductory talk by saying that this is really not about cultural essentialism. I want to think with Francois Julien, who recently published this kind of wonderful little book called There's No Such Thing as Cultural Identity. I like it. The fact that the title of the book is actually a sentence, which really indicates how important that sentence is. And the idea is that cultures to him are resources and not possessions. So today we actually have a kind of paradoxical situation that we, almost the entire world speak some kind of English, and Julien calls it globish. It's an interesting term, but it's pretty true actually. There's a globish that we speak, but we also at the same time assert identity, cultural identity, national identity. But they're really very similar, similarly, expressed. It's that kind of cars and car brands, and they're all the same, but then branded differently. So that's really the kind of lack of linguistic diversity in the world that we are facing, and it's really creating cultural poverty for us. So I want to kind of expand that in the third lecture. Instead, we really should, think about our work, at least part of our work, as the maintenance of diversity. And the word that Julien uses is écart, which is the French word means divide or divergence. And that it is really by virtue of this divergence that a dialogue is possible. Otherwise, you're just basically sitting in the echo chamber and, kind of at each other's throat and then trying to, kind of kill one another or something like that. But rather than that, we really should kind of have dialogues, genuine dialogues. And, for dialogues to take place, you need genuine difference. And this linguistic difference, diversity, can be something that can be made into a productive feature of our current cultural life. Okay, so that's what I have for today. It's a kind of, as I say, it's an introduction to the topic, and we'll get a little bit deeper in the next two lectures.
Yeah, great. We're still in your last conclusion of the lecture today. I think it's a really interesting culture as a resources instead of the procession. That's really deep thought of the topic. And I think the culture is quite diverse right now globally. And we should rethinking this kind of what is a culture? Actually, it's an activity of thought, or is expanding the potential creativity for the evolution of the planet. The planet as the scenario for the different cultures. I think it's really interesting. I'm still in the conclusion.
that yes, there are lots of cultures, but then they converge. This is really the whole kind of Indo-European expansion theory, which is that it's not stopping. Chinese were nearly made into a phonetic language.
Yeah.
And it didn't. I mean, I'm so glad that it didn't, Like the Vietnamese became phonetic. And
yeah, I think, we have a lot of questions because it's such a profound system to introduce the language, especially address the language into the culture and into the architecture language, the pattern of language. So I want to maybe put forward some of the questions to your thought and opinion inside your lecture. So first, I'm very interested in the diagram you put forward in the middle of the lecture and showing the thought, language, and architecture. You go back to that PPT, and we have some question to the diagram: thought, language, and architecture. I think it's extremely important. I remember 2 years ago, I invite Bernard Stiegler to give a lecture, who is a philosopher, and he put forward a very interesting opinion. I remind from your diagram. I think he actually mentioned the special word grammarization.
Yes. Yeah.
Not grammanology, it's grammarization. It's kind of, he focused not on the character, not on the hieroglyphic or the character culture for different alphabet culture for the different language, but he put forward grammarization is the most important difference after the structuralism. So I want to ask you the question. Actually, I think it's language not equal architecture. It's not equal to the architecture. Maybe the thought make decision, different thought will leading to different style, different architecture, which exist on different part of the planet. So maybe is that the potential linkage or relationship, the thought really influenced by the language, or I think architecture maybe, which is a representation of the thinking, a representation of the culture, or representation of the lifestyle. And what's the influence? Actually, I think there should be some initial influence from the language. Probably it's not the alphabet system or the character system, or the I think you mentioned the hieroglyphic system of the language. Probably is the grammar. What's the difference, do you think, between this kind of alphabet system, Indo language system, the difference between that to Chinese, which is quite hieroglyphic language? Is there any initial difference between this background? And also,
as in my lecture, the difference is actually night and day. I'm going to talk about it in my third lecture. Basically, Indo-European languages is all grammar. That's why Derrida says philosophy is actually grammatology. Yeah, Chinese has no grammar.
No grammar.
No grammar. Words don't change.
Chinese have some grammar, but I think the grammar is quite different to
you don't call it grammar
system. It's a different system, but we have grammar.
It's a system. No, this is not a criticism. It's actually a praise in these three lectures. It's actually, this is exactly why we're made to think that Western philosophy is grammatology. Yeah. This is exactly how Derrida started. I think he started by looking at Chinese. And same with Heidegger. Heidegger wrote by looking at Chinese. So the Chinese is actually almost like a critical sounding board for Western philosophy, in the sense that this work is played out. I'm going to go into that much deeper in the third lecture. That making the capturing of grammar is in the language, and then it is actually grammatized in thought, and then that produces an impact on.
So yeah, I think this kind of grammarology or grammarization actually is a reflection of the thinking, how the designer or the subject of the designer human who design or construct the building. I think that is extremely.
I can tell you, it's very attractive as a design method because it's very easy. It's very systematic. It's almost like a science. It gives you a lot of comfort. But that's really not how, for example, Yuan is designed. There's no grammar there. So think about that, and it's there's really, so that's the kind of relationship that I want to talk about. The problem with grammatology or I don't know, like even Bernard Stiegler, is that they don't really work with the Chinese language. They don't really have that linguistic reality in them to be able to think through this question. So it's always a version of the Indo-European philosophical and structure that is so focused on, even in its critique, like Derrida, it's so focused on what I'm going to describe as phonocentrism, which is really that it is about the critique of grammar.
Yeah, but I need some time to rethinking on why Chinese have no grammar. Actually, when we educate the primary student, very young student in China, they actually have some grammar courses.
The grammar,
but this grammar may be different to the
grammar. I can tell you, the grammar was really introduced in the late 19th century and Chinese reformers by basically imitating Western grammar book and then start to introduce 主语, 谓语, 宾语. That really is not how it was originally thought, If you actually read 庄子, for example, you don't have that. So no, I'm not talking about, I really, it's important to understand that 20th century is quite special for China. Things changed a lot and not always, I mean, there are also challenges for China, but I think we're really talking about a very kind of rudimentary intellectual development that you can actually see very early on in the culture's development. So the Chinese grammar, of course, I mean, some people will get offended and say, oh, the Chinese does not have grammar. I really meant it in a complimentary way. I meant it in the sense that the Western philosophy is trapped in the endless elaboration of grammatical structures.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Actually, yesterday we have a specialist, Daniel Bodigan, who actually make profound research in the artificial intelligence. I think it's a very interesting linguistic. It's also an interesting structure.
Oh, totally interesting.
Yeah, because he point out the latent system or latent data system of all the possibility in the world. That's also philosophy question. Everything is there. So the human being actually only searching for the only possibility you prefer, and also physical.
And that often is actually determined by grammatical structures.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe the grammarization here is the definition or critical thinking to the Indo-English culture.
I think more people should speak Chinese, and so they know.
Exactly. So the Chinese may be like Chinese garden, and all the elements in the garden is there, but actually the initial logic or initial grammar is quite profound. I think the artificial intelligence is doing the similar thing. They're searching the detour, the new reorganization assemblage of all these elements to produce a kind of feedback reflection of the space.
This AI thing in the beginning was called parametric design. Parameters actually are grammatical.
Exactly.
Yeah. So today, I mean, that word is not used, and we use AI instead. So I think in the Chinese way of doing things, there's high intelligence, low parameters. That's really it's really interesting to think about. This is exactly what I want to talk about in the third lecture.
Another interesting, because the topic is about the Indo-English and also China's the Sino language, right? So I think Chinese are kind of from our tradition, from Chinese, I think is a hieroglyphic. It's like the pictogram process represent. It's like you mentioned the water. The water in Chinese is a kind of hieroglyphic abstractness. I think it's still an abstractness of the water. It's like a drawing, like calligraphy of mountain, and in between the mountain is a linear flowing form. That's the water. I think it's a kind of hieroglyphic description or representation of the object.
Mhm.
And this kind of transformation is initially is quite different. So in Egypt and in some Arabian countries, the character or the alphabet is also similar to China, but the grammar system is different. But actually, you mentioned the Indo-English system is from starting from Ukraine, Western South Russian. That's maybe 10,000 or 8,000 years ago. So I think that system is actually based on the alphabet and the reorganization of the alphabet.
Sure.
And the alphabet to character, and also the grammar make different meaning, and set up like representation. The ways of representation is a ways of thinking. It's quite a different thinking process.
Yes.
So we want to review the potential philosophy of or the abstractness between these two different cultures. Could you briefly give us a conclusion on your opinion? So what's the initial difference between these two systems? You're talking about a lot of interesting divergence but actually we still want to know the difference. What do you think the obvious difference between these two systems?
Well, the obvious thinking is difference is that that the Indo-Europeans tend to think in abstraction. You know, mathematical formulas and principles and laws and the supernatural beings and so on. And the Chinese tend to think with things. It's in the language. When you say, abstract ideas is always demonstrated through actual things. Like, say, gravity, you would say 水往低处流, like the water flows from high ground to low ground, as a way to kind of prove the truth. So the truth is in things. So that would be the most obvious, and that I will, obviously I talk about that in the next two lectures. To me, that's probably the most consequential. One is thinking in abstraction, which I think is a language characteristics. Yeah. And one is thinking in actual things. So in philosophy,
extremely interesting topic. Extremely interesting topic, actually, which also influenced the autonomy of the modernism in architecture. And when I remember when Pete Heisman coming to Shanghai, make the lecture and introduce his PhD thesis, I think it's around.
He's a grammatarian.
Yeah, exactly. That's a structuralism. I think totally based on the abstractness. He's thinking, which give the energy.
You can tell me.
Yeah.
What is abstract in Zhou Zhengyuan?
I think it's maybe high dimensional abstractness in the mind. It's a mindscape. The mindscape is not 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional. Actually, that is the abstractness or the intention of design. I think it's more high hierarchy. When we talk about, make a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence.
That is really, it's really about losing the human perspective, but taking on a
exactly
a third view. Yeah,
I think it's a kind of pre-artificial, a pre-intelligence. I think for Chinese garden, a lot of intellectual academic people in China, actually, the scholars, they make a lot of research on the grammar system of Chinese garden. Actually, a lot of critics to them. It's really difficult.
It's very
because
difficult. I
depends
think
on time, depends on climate, depends on the timing process, including the greeneries in the garden, the water in the garden, the fishes in the garden. Everything could be the special character to redefine the initial logic experience of the garden.
so. This
It's,
kind of needs to be played out in a kind of study and research analysis of grammar-centric architectural culture.
exactly. So the modernism is
Really,
actually
and
based on
also to be able to kind of do enough research to make us feel, to make, you know, the Chinese language relevant, or Chinese architecture relevant. So there's a dialogue, you know, exactly like what Francois Julien is saying, that dialogue really has to be based on, you know, you being able to articulate it, you know, in a way that has a connection with the West. Yeah, and well, Indo-European civilization has been very, very successful. And it really, there's no doubt, you know.
Yeah, I think, Shishao, you're posing out a very interesting question, research academic question, which especially have a strong relevance to our discipline, because we always, in China, we always make a lot of discussion about high culture, low culture. Why this kind of new theory or new thinking is always right now putting forward by some like Western theorists or the researchers, academic scholars. But China is actually more focused on the implementation or the scenarios which have really experienced or touching materialized or material process. So I think that's maybe the difference for the modernism in China and the modernism in the world. And so I also, yeah.
In theory, I think Chinese as a language is at disadvantage because it really is not inflected. That's what I've been arguing, that the inflection of a language, its grammar, is actually the theory. Yeah, so that's a kind of dilemma. In a way, I think one needs to be like a bicultural enterprise to do it. And there are certain, to me, distinctive advantages that why we should do this. You know, diversity is one, but also I think we cannot endlessly think about the world as abstractions because it's real.
Yeah.
You think about the world as abstractions.
That's materialism. We name as and also Delanda, Manuel Delanda put forward a new theory about materialism. Sure. So I think the new materialism actually is another jumping to different world. Actually, we find is the planet and the global situation is so complicated right now. And some of them is not just based on the simple grammar, simple rules. We should the rethinking on the new layers of the planet, or terraforming the planet in different ways. Actually, I think in Chinese intellectual philosophy, we have some profound solution or the judgment or reflection on the process of life, actually, which cannot be easily translate into simple grammar system. Just like Bernard Stiegler in his lecture, he admired the Chinese culture a lot. And the only keywords of his lecture, his last lecture of his life, because 2 weeks later he suicide. And the keywords of his lecture is grammarization. I think he actually gave us a new suggestion. The world should be reorganized by the genius system, probably integrate the human being and the artificial intelligence. I think it's not a human-centric future. It should be a human-machine collaborating future, which should redefine the systematic the systems of the planet, which based on the layers, the cloud, the connections, and also including the website, which is totally.
I think it's also worthwhile. Yeah, it's also worthwhile to read Joseph Needham, because the Chinese technological development, the Chinese historically have had a lot of very accomplished technological developments, but they're different from the Western technological developments. And that really is worthwhile to think about. And I think Joseph Needham is certainly a good person to think with.
Yes. I remember when you talk about the signifier, the water, still the water in your lecture, signifier, signify, and I think that's very clear of the comparison of Chinese and English about the representation of water. What is water? The substance water. And I remember Pete Eisman also in his book, his PhD research also mentioned a lot about this kind of structuralism based relationship.
Yeah. No, he started. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
It's just that he's a primatarian. That's what it is, and he's exactly doing language equal architecture, which is not what I.
So I think the most important diagram of your lecture is the thought language and architecture, but the language never equal to architecture, right? That's your opinion. Great. So a lot of thinking. I make different notes. I think it's profound thinking from the linguistic perspective, rethinking on the cultural difference and rethinking on the architecture, evolution, architecture, culture. It's really interesting. And the conclusion, the culture, very open. I think culture is as a resource, or as resources. Yes, that's right. I think I really appreciate that.
There's a question in the chat saying that the Chinese is developing into a phonetic more and more. It's becoming more and more phonetic.
Yeah, you're seeing the. So, Chao, do you have any question from the students?
Oh, well, yes, there's a question in the chat box. Oh, actually, thank you, Professor Lee. It's a really inspiring lecture. I do have a question, but it's not really a question. Also regarding to this diagram. So we know there's a famous theory in structuralism saying something like our thoughts or our rational thoughts are structured by our language. So in other words, we can only think something that is describable by our language. But in architecture, as well as in some other art forms, especially those associated with ideas of phenomenology or speculative realism, currently we usually looking at architecture. We usually looking for something or some scenario where the space or spatiality cannot be thought rationally or cannot be described by language. A scenario where the senses, the embodiment, or the subconsciousness arises. And for sure, in English and in Chinese, the things we cannot describe with our language are totally different. There's something we can describe in Chinese, but it's really difficult to describe in English. I think any of us done translation will be aware of that. And also, maybe there's something we can describe by our traditional Chinese language, but it's really difficult to describe with our modern Chinese language. So my question, and it's not really a question, have you thought or what do you think of this kind of incapability of language describing things influence our
design? Well, it's, I mean, that's, last time I talked about this was a conference about translation. The thing is that there will never be perfect translation. That's why it's important to keep the languages as they are, rather than kind of destroy them or think that my language is better than yours, you know, and why don't you speak mine? This is really the line of European colonization for 200 years or 300 years, that they've been really forcing people to speak colonizers' language. So I think that untranslatability between languages is precisely the divergence, the écart, the divide that must be maintained so that we can have a dialogue. It doesn't need to be a perfect 100% match. There's no need. Actually, not only there's no need, we need that difference. We need that unmatch so that we can have a rich production. You know, that's the gap that becomes the productive space. I think just coming to the question that the student asked in Chinese, which is about the historical development of Chinese becoming more and more phonetic, which is interesting. I think in the end, in essence, Chinese language is not phonetic. It basically introduced phonetic words to mitigate, to increase clarity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it has not changed in nature. It's just that it is really, you know, because the contact with European languages and you know, and people realize that if we actually put these words in, that's more or less kind of mimicking the grammatical markers in European languages, you can express yourself clearly or more clearly. That does not mean that Chinese has become phonetic. No, it's not. Mm-hmm. It's just a development. All languages change. You know, this is just a particular way that the Chinese language changed historically over time. The second question is to do with, in Chinese, 80% of the language has some kind of indication, phonetic indicator. I think this is exactly the argument of William Hannes in his thesis that the Chinese is actually just in the process of becoming phonetic, but it's imperfect. You know, like I don't agree with that assessment because they are indicators. They are really assistants to how you pronounce it. You know, how you say it. It's important to speak, but I think the fundamental structure of the Chinese language does not come from notations of sound. Yeah, it is then retrofitted with sound to make it speakable. So I guess you know that you have to kind of really understand it from a very deep level and not just kind of noticing that, okay, well, there are kind of phonetic indications. Of course, all languages indicate how to say it, but that's, you know, that's really not the fundamental idea of the Chinese language. It's shape, not sound. Mm. I think both Benjamin and Walter Benjamin and Martin Heidegger, two very influential philosopher, but also Jean-Francois Lyotard, who they actually both wrote, all of them wrote something about the kind of the problem of the signifier, the problem of the sign, which is really a key component in Western philosophy in the past 20 years or 30 years. That I think indicates a uncertainty or some kind of perception crisis in Western philosophy that I think, thinking with Chinese is a really good way to get around that. It really it's a fascinating way to be able to think both. I just, I guess that's what I'm doing. That on the one hand, actually, by the way, this whole lecture series comes from the content that are being preparing for a special issue of Theory, Culture, Society called Against Ontology. So the real issue is ontology, or the lack of it.
So you mean against?
Against ontology, yes. So that's the title of the special issue.
Okay. That's interesting.
Ontology is, of course, the Greek version of the Indo-European thought, which basically is the philosophy that you find in Europe and America. Yeah. So that really is fascinating, and it's going to come out soon. So I'll let you know when.
Looking forward to read it. I'm looking forward to reading it.
So I spent quite a lot of time. It was really absolutely amazing pleasure to be able to work with so many scholars and write my own chapter and write the introduction, and it's amazing thing. So a lot of it is really to do with thinking through grammatization or ontology or structuralism, pattern recognition, looking the way the unfixing of the eye, which is really focused on the perspective. Instead, you really look at, the eye kind of floats, like when you look at Jing Yin Shang He Tu, the eye floats. It has no perspective. But then it's also not the God's eye view. So
multi-perspective join. Multi-perspective joins in Chinese Asian painting. Yes.
Or maybe just non-perspective, just drop the word perspective because it has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
If you say non-perspective, you make a reference to perspective as the norm,
But Shiqiao, it's really important right now, especially for me and my team. Actually, we're working a lot on the scripting, on the Python or C#, this kind of a language. It's another linguistic system, but it's based on the English language. But actually, when we goes to the artificial intelligence, which actually critically rethinking on this kind of grammar systems, which are produced by the scripting language, because it's written by English, right? But all the potential possibility is out of the imagination or in the black box, which can reveal a lot of potential abstractness in the future. It's kind of collage or differential changes or this kind of unlinear possibilities. So like the structuralization of the grammar system should be challenged, maybe not from the scripting process, probably goes to how to write this kind of scripts and how to define this kind of thinking process.
I'm so glad you said it, because I wanted to say it, but then I thought that I was really sure. Grammatization is not the only way to organize thought. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's the point of the Eastern culture. It's so profound. It's difficult to be analyzed. Maybe it's difficult to analyze
in combination. I think in combination, it's that productive gap that I was describing, that we should be able to do something.
Mm-hmm. Good, very interesting. I think it's a good starting point and interesting lecture Shiqiao gave us, and I think it's a great opportunity, especially to the Chinese student, have this opportunity to listen to this.
Yeah, come back tomorrow. We have more exciting.
Looking forward to tomorrow's lecture. Thanks a lot. I think it's a great discussion with you, and it's a great lecture. We make a lot of notes, and we should be thinking on your thought, and looking forward to read your new book. I think it's extremely interesting to us. Thank you so much, Shiqiao.
Yeah, I think I was told by the publisher that it's going to be approved for distribution soon in China. So
okay, great.
So
it's written in English or Chinese?
What?
The new book written in Chinese or English?
In English.
Okay. Maybe you should have a Chinese version. We can more.
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to. If the publisher can translate it. Yeah.
Yes, I like your English writing a lot, because I read your book, which is a modernity of Chinese city. I remember. I don't know if the right name of your book.
Understanding the Chinese city. Yeah.
Yeah, re-understand the Chinese city. I read it when I fly from China to States. I think in 7 hours, and from the first page to the end. It's so well written. I think I like your language. It's also the skills of writing. I think it's extremely attractive and impressive for the book.
Well, yeah. Thank you. Well, I mean, like as I said in the beginning, that ever since I became a student, transitioning from Chinese to English, and that thought never went away, which is really this whole.
Oh, Xiangning is still here. Xiangning, would you like to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I participated in also a dialogue with Shiqiao, organized by Rosanna Hu a couple of weeks ago. So I do appreciate his knowledge about Chinese urbanism and architecture and Asia. So I do feel that maybe we could consider, beside publishing maybe a Chinese edition of the books, but also to invite Professor Li Shiqiao to be a guest professor into our College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and so we could bring him often to the school to communicate with us and to give our PhD students and graduate students more chances to exposure on to the knowledge about Chinese architecture and urbanism from outside, from another perspective, from rather than inside out. It's a outside in kind of a different angle to rethink and thinking about critique to contemporary Chinese architecture and urbanism. So I do appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. I would be delighted. Whenever
I think it's right. Yeah, we should invite you.
When I can travel to China.
I hope that from end of this year, the policy could be more open to available for international traveling. That may be a good chance for both sides, for people outside China and also for us who want to travel. We haven't been traveling outside China for 3 years till now.
Yeah. So right now, all restrictions are off for us. There's no requirement.
So the online lecture is another option.
So we're lucky to have this opportunity to invite you to give us.
It's something, I know it's about digital future, but then I'm also worried about the biological future. There's something about content which is really important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Xiangning.
Okay.
Thank you both, and Channing, and appreciation of all your comments.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.